We have a great honor bestowed on us here this afternoon to introduce our next speaker. His immigrant father never finished high school, but he earned his college degree in 3 years when he was 19 years old. He earned his MBA from Wharton Business School in 15 months when he was 22. He was appointed assistant professor at New York University when he was 24, the youngest officer of Citibank when he was 22, vice president at 25, and made his first million before he was 26. In 1991, he wrote a book, Unlimited Wealth. Crown Publishers, his new book, has been praised throughout the nation by business people, which is unusual for a book about economics, especially businessmen like Sam Walton. Pilser was appointed economic advisor to both Reagan and Bush administration and has been a candidate for the U.S. Congress. He's a regular commentator on CNN, National Public Radio's Marketplace, and Larry King Live. His new book, Unlimited Wealth. I'd like to introduce to you this afternoon the economist, Paul Zane Pilser.
I have to take issue, though, with one word of that introduction, which I thank you very much for, except where you referred to me as an economist. I remember back when I was in college, then graduate school, and no one in my family, my father hadn't finished high school, let alone college. And as I was going for all these degrees, my mother was asked, Mrs. Pilser, what's Paul studying all these time? What does he want to be? And my mother said, oh, Paul wants to be an economist. Very proud. And people would say, Mrs. Pilser, what's an economist? And my mother, a little thrown by the question, would say, I think an economist is someone who's very, very, very good with numbers, but doesn't have enough personality to become an accountant. So I hope this afternoon, as I get to share with you some thoughts on what's happening in our economy today, that I won't live up to my mother's definition of an economist. One of economists' favorite stories, when people ask them what's going to happen, they're supposed to know, the modern soothsayers, was told when President Truman was listening to the testimony of an economist before Congress. And this economist said, and this will happen next quarter. So President Truman interrupted him and said, aha, so next quarter interest rates are going to go down. To which the economist said, not so fast, Mr. President. On the other hand, this and this could happen, and they could go up. To which President Truman interrupted and said, what this country needs is a good one-handed economist. But belying all the stories and the jokes about economists and our inability to explain what's going on and what we see around us is something much more serious. At this point in economic history, the one thing virtually all economists in the world will agree on today is that none of them know the answer. We don't know what makes our economy grow. We don't know why some people we don't like their morals, we don't like the way they do business, and they make a lot of money. And how many of us, all of us, have a relative we love, we cherish, a person we see trying harder and harder and harder again and again and keeps on failing? How many of us with confidence, if you remember the movie, the 1967 movie, The Graduate, the boy asks his uncle, what should he do to be successful? And what does the uncle tell the boy in the 1967 movie? Plastics. Exactly. How many of us today, when our children come home after all the fighting and the arguing and all the things we tell them to do, they're 22 years old, your son or daughter is graduating college, and they turn to you and say, Mom, Dad, please, I'm scared. I'm graduating next year. I'm really worried about making a living. What do I do? And how many of us, with the confidence of that uncle in the 1967 movie, could turn to our children without bias and say, this is what you should do? What we see is that we are totally without a working theory to explain what we see in our everyday lives. And that's not funny. And we just joke about it rather than keep searching for it. Economics today is very much similar to where medicine was 100 years ago. Think back 100 years ago. Doctors knew when you got sick If you had this symptom, take this drug. If you had this symptom, take this pill or do this behavior. But they didn't know why. Until physicians developed the theories of bacteria, of inoculation, of viruses, and they could explain why, good medical care was something nobody could afford. In fact, by the time a doctor learned all the things he was supposed to learn to be able to give good medical care, he passed away. And he couldn't transfer that knowledge. Today, you walk into any city in the world, and you go up to a doctor, you don't even ask where he went to medical school, you're sick, he puts a needle in your arm, you take an injection, you feel great. Because today we have working theories to explain what we see in medicine. And it's only the few diseases that we haven't conquered yet that we complain about. You remember that in most of our lifetimes, polio was something you worried and hoped that the child next door got instead of your child. And we've conquered virtually all of our medical problems because we have working theories to explain what we see in our everyday lives. Unlimited wealth is my wife's and my first attempt at a working economic theory that explains to business people, not to other academics, what we see in our everyday lives. The book, oddly enough, opens up with a story from 2,500 years ago with Aristotle. Around the time of Aristotle, 2,500 years ago, people didn't wonder about such questions. In fact, the great theologian St. Augustine was once asked, St. Augustine, what did God do before he created the universe? And St. Augustine turned to the questioner and said, he was busy creating a hell for people like you who ask such questions. Today, we do ask. And we encourage our children to ask questions why, and we search for the answers. But at the time of Aristotle, 2,500 years ago, people were told, don't try to plant crops in the spring and hope you'll have a harvest in the fall. Don't domesticate animals. Don't build a house. You don't have any control over your life. This is how they thought 2,500 years ago. You can't do anything. Why? Because up in the sky, there are these gods who wander around up there. Remember the planets? The planets are named after gods. And they believed each one of those gods controls your life. So why try? The gods determine whether you'll have good fortune, whether you'll be in love, whether you'll be healthy, whether you'll have food. In fact, the very word planet comes from the Greek word, planet, to wander. Because that's how they thought about the gods. The gods wander around in the heavens and do things that affect our lives. So you have no control over your destiny. One of the first people who said, no, there is an order to the universe God has created, and you, mankind, control your own destiny, was Aristotle. Aristotle developed the model of spheres, where he put the Earth at the center, and all the planets revolving in defined orbits around the Earth. And he said, there'll always be spring and summer and fall, and he created the calendar. And the Aristotle calendar became the bedrock of civilization, because with a calendar, when you know spring and fall are coming, you can plan food, you can plan your life, and make your life different. The Aristotle calendar, of course, wasn't perfect. It had the Earth at the center instead of the sun. But think about it, the time of Aristotle or even today. Look up at the heavens. Doesn't it seem obvious that all the planets revolve around the Earth? So the Aristotle calendar worked for about 2,000 years, until about the 15th century. Here's why. Because the Aristotle calendar put the Earth at the center instead of the sun, it was a little off. How off? Every 100 years, it would snow in July in Rome. And the Pope would say, calendar's off, crank it back 6 months. He would declare June to be January, and they would have an accurate calendar. This went on from about 900 to 1500. So the people who were astronomers, if you were an astronomer at the time of Galileo or Copernicus, and people said, what do you do? Oh, I'm an astronomer. I'm trying to find the right calendar, the perfect calendar that will accurately predict the seasons and how the planets move around the Earth. Notice something? The very definition of being an astronomer, how the planets revolve around the Earth, precluded you from discovering the correct answer that the planets, including the Earth, all revolve around the sun. So how could an astronomer figure the correct answer? The first astronomer to figure this out was Copernicus. He was a Polish astronomer, very mathematical, who using mathematical equations put forth the theory that if you put the sun at the center instead of the Earth, you have a working calendar. And he showed it just with mathematical equations. Copernicus had the good fortune to pass away before he published his theory, which was pretty radical back then. About 80 years later, Galileo, in Italy, reading Copernicus' work written in Polish, had something that no one else had before. Remember, Galileo invented the telescope. So he took Copernicus' work, he looked up at the heavens, and he could see visual proof that Copernicus was right. The planets revolve around the sun. Galileo published his work and was ordered by the Pope never again to publish it. Oddly enough, he published it in Italian for the average person when everything at that time was published in Latin. And Galileo was told they'd burn him at the stake if he ever again said that, because it was such a radical theory that the Earth was not at the center of the universe. About 20 years later, Galileo's best friend and college roommate became the Pope. Pope had to go to college and grow up with someone. So Galileo, when his friend became the Pope, said, now I'll go forward and I'll publish my theory, which he did. And the Pope literally brought Galileo to the stake and was about to burn him at the stake until he recanted and said, I was wrong. He never really believed that. The planets revolve around the Earth, not the sun. What we see in that is two things. One, that often the definition of what we're trying to study precludes us from the correct answer, like the definition of astronomy that said the Earth is at the center of the universe. Two, people don't react well to being told something different. I mean, think, why should people get upset whether the Earth or the sun is at the center of the universe? And yet the Pope felt it was his moral duty at that time to burn his best friend at the stake rather than accept something that so changed their core beliefs. The reason this is so important is that I believe that economics today is hampered by the same sort of tunnel vision. And that's the reason we don't have economic theories that explain what we see every day going on in our lives. If you'll open up your college or senior in high school textbook on economics and look at the first page, it will say, economics is the study of scarce resources. The very science of economics is the study of how there's a fixed supply out there of land, of oil, of minerals, of wealth. And the only way you're going to get a little more is by taking it from someone else. First line in every economics textbook. Economics is the study of scarce resources, or society's allocation of scarce resources. Who should we give the oil, the wealth to? Who should we tax, and who should we allocate these scarce resources? The very definition of economics totally contradicts our Judeo-Christian ethic of God. A true and just God would not create a world with a fixed supply of resources where all his children get ahead by taking from somebody else. And yet for 400 years, the science of economics is there's a fixed supply of resources out there. And how you get ahead is by taking from someone else. The first group of people in history who said, no, we don't only get ahead by taking from someone else, were the first alchemists. Many people think that today they laugh. They think of an alchemist as a wizard, sort of this guy who tries to stir up chemicals and make gold. The alchemists were people throughout history who firmly believed that if there was a true and just God, and the early alchemists from 300 to 900 AD were very wrapped up into early Christianity, and they firmly believed that if there was a true and just God, he wouldn't let us take an army and go kill the people next door and take their gold. God would give us the ability to make gold by mixing up chemicals and lead and mercury with a lot of prayer. And when you read the early alchemists' incantations for how to make gold, it's 10% mixing chemicals and 90% prayer. God will give us the ability to create wealth without taking it from someone else. Today people laugh at alchemists. I tend to think the alchemists were truly successful. Because had those early alchemists made gold, which by the way today is child's play for a nuclear physicist, but had the early alchemists been able to create gold out of lead, gold would have been worthless. Everyone would have gold. It wouldn't have been wealth. While trying to make gold, they discovered something called pharmacy, chemistry, metallurgy, engineering, all the technology that has given us the unlimited wealth or unlimited resources we have today. So they really reached their end goal, which is the ability to supply food, housing, anything we want for everyone in our society. Had they made gold, it would have been worthless. Although today we laugh at alchemists and still think of it as a negative term. Now you may stop here and say, that sounds nice, we have unlimited everything, right? That's what this guy's telling me. But you might say, that's not true. I mean, we don't have unlimited everything, we're running out of oil. Haven't you been told that? We're running out of land. We're overpopulating the earth. Wrong. We have been told that. We have been told that again and again. It's not true. And to understand why that's not true, we have to go to the origins of what we've been told. In 1971, there was a group of scientists that got together called the Club of Rome. And they met, 80 of them in Rome, a few Nobel Prize winners, heads of state. And in 1971, they came out with a paper called the Club of Rome Pronouncements for the World. It made the cover of Time magazine. And they said in 1971 that in 40 years, the world runs out of oil. How'd they say that? They counted up all the oil reserves in the world, proven reserves. They figured out what we use per day. And they said in 40 years, we run out of oil. And some people, even though it was on the cover of Time, said that's not true. Well, in 1973, when the Arab oil embargo hit and we were all on gas lines, the Club of Rome became the accepted dogma of the day. We're running out of oil, 40 years, civilization stops. So here we are 21 years later, and we go back to the same scientists, and we say, in 1971, you told me we had 40 years left of oil. Today, 21 years later, do we have 19 years left? They go, no, no, no. You have 90 years left, not 19. I said, how can I have 90 years left in 92 when in 1971 I had 40 years? Oh, they say, I didn't know that you would invent an electronic fuel injector that would double the fuel economy of every car in America in less than 5 years, effectively doubling the supply of oil by halving its use. Oh, I didn't know that the Alaskan oil, which I counted, but discounted in 1971, because in 1971, the oil the U.S. had in Alaska, it was impossible to get to within 40 years with existing technology. And we built the Alaskan pipeline in 1977. And they go, I didn't know that you'd improve the way you use heating oil in your homes, and then I didn't know you'd learn how to drill 10 miles down. I only counted proven reserves as 6 miles under. In other words, they say that advancing technology now says we have 90 years left of oil, and it's almost universally accepted today, although it doesn't make headlines anymore, that we're not running out of oil, or tin, or lead, or any of the materials that were critical in the 1970s. But in the 1970s, we developed this attitude that we're running out of everything. By the way, historically, none of this was anything new. The whole world industrial world ran on whale oil from the 13th to the 19th century. Whale oil was what they made candles out of and ran all the machines for the Industrial Revolution. And in 1850, the world had its first major energy crisis. In 1850, Yankee whaling ships harvested, think of this number, 10,000 whales a year out of the North Atlantic. And after killing 10,000 whales, there were no more whales. And they were predicting the end of the empire, Britain and America. And then in 1859, an American colonel in Pennsylvania discovered petroleum, which replaced whale oil. And in 1870, the greatest economist of the world was a man named Jevons. And Jevons in 1870 was knighted by the Queen in 1870 for writing a paper that showed how the British Empire ends in 1900 because we run out of coal. And of course, by 1900, had they kept going, we would have run out of coal, except they switched from coal to petroleum by 1900. What we see throughout history is that we're not running out of anything. We always have an expanding universe of resources, because what we see is it's the human ingenuity that really creates them. In writing Unlimited Wealth, my wife and I have tried to break these down into 6 laws, a theory that tries to explain to people what they see in their everyday lives, both as a member of society and as a small business person. The 6 laws we call the theory of economic alchemy, and the first one says there are no resources to run out of. There are no oil, land that we're ever going to run out of, because the resources themselves are an invention of the human mind. Not only is oil an invention of the human mind, remember it was something bad only 100 years ago that polluted the water. Think of land itself. The land, we're going to run out of land, right, to live on, run out of land to support people with food. Land wasn't a resource until a human being learned how to domesticate animals and how to farm it. Our ancestors were hunter-gatherers who would take the food off the land and move to other land. That's why the Native Americans would laugh hysterically when the white man would come from Europe and pay him money for the land that they had just taken the food off of. They said, the land has no value. It's the food on the land, which we just harvested. Now we're moving on to other land. So land itself, oil, tin, gold, all the resources we call wealth are constantly changing over time because we're constantly inventing and defining new resources. Second law of economic alchemy. At any given moment in time, and this is interesting, you'd say, but wait a minute, I live in 1992 and I need to know now how much oil there is. I need to know now how much land there is to plan this investment. I need to know now how much of a given resource. Well, traditional economists will go out there and say, count it. Want to know how much land there is in North Carolina? Count it. Want to know how much oil there is? Count it. Wrong. The supply of an existing defined resource, second law of economic alchemy, is entirely determined by technology. It is human ingenuity technology that defines how much oil we have, both by defining the technology of extracting oil from the ground and, more importantly, defining the technology of using the oil we already have. When the fuel injector from 1980 to 1985, replacing a carburetor, doubled fuel economy of every car in America, it doubled our supply of gasoline. And we're about to double again just in this decade, which is a 4 times improvement on new advances we're putting into our cars. Remember, cars used to get about 9 miles a gallon, and now we're getting about 22. Best example, really, though, is farmland. In 1930, in this country, we had a population of 100 million people. And 30 million of that 100 million in 1930 were farmers. So in 1930, 30 million farmers working the land barely produced enough food for 100 million people. By 1980, 50 years later, 300,000 farmers, working much less land, produced more than enough food for 300 million people and could export half again as much food. What matters is not how much land you have, but the technology of farming, and over the last century we've increased crop yields over 100 times per acre. So what we see in the second law of economic alchemy is that even of the defined resources we struggle so hard to get and we think we're running out of, and we are told by economists, look at the supply, it's really human ingenuity of using them that determines how valuable they are to us. What we see in this, and I should explain in a moment, is that technology has advanced so fast and so lowered the cost of all the raw materials we were always supposed to struggle for and have wars over and conquer other people for, that making things is no longer, in any way, any type of key to success. Let's deviate here and talk about retailing a minute. Walk into a store and buy a product for, say, $100. And now pick up the product, and you guys can look up and figure out what does it really cost. The average product in a store today that sells for $100 only cost about $15 fully loaded manufacturing parts and labor to make. $85 is in distributing the product to the end consumer. Now, in the past, it was the opposite. It was so expensive when you didn't have plastics and petroleum products and technology to make things that it was $85 cost of making it and $15 cost of transporting it or moving it somewhere. Today, we've so lowered the cost of distribution that 85% of the cost is in distribution because manufacturing fall into 15%. I'll give you a better example of what's really happened in the last 20 years. In the 1960s, a product in a store that would cost $300 was $150 manufacturing and $150 distribution. So think of that number. $300 product in a store. Remember, the store would buy it for $150, double it to $300 and sell it. Today, that same quality product is not made for $150. It's made for $15. We have so lowered the cost of manufacturing products because the raw materials are everywhere and so inexpensive due to technology that the $150 cost of making the product has fallen to $15. Distribution costs have fallen too. The $300 product that cost $150 to get to the store and sell today has dropped to $85. So we have a $100 product, as I started out with, of which $85 is the distribution cost, down from $150 over the last 20 years, and a $15 manufacturing cost, down from $150. Total price $100 for the same quality item. Now, you might say, okay, so yeah, distribution's $85 and manufacturing's $15. Now, in 1965, when it was $150 to make, do you think you could go out and get rich finding a better way to make it for $150 down to $70 or down to $50? Right? If you lowered manufacturing costs in the 60s from $150 to $75, 50%, you made a lot of money. You saved $75 on the product. And we encouraged all our children to go into the business of making things. Back to the movie The Graduate, plastics. Make things. It's good for America. Lower the cost of goods and services. Well, today, when you go in the store and the product costs $100, and $15 is the manufacturing cost and $85 is the distribution, you think you're going to save a lot of money cutting the manufacturing cost by 10 or 20%? How much are you going to save if you cut the $15 manufacturing cost by 10%? $1.50 in the retail price on a $100 item. How much are you going to save if you manage to find a way to cut the distribution costs by 10 or 20%? Now, if this was all true, because it sort of shocks people, they have to take out their pencils and walk in the store and say, you're right, all that plastic and stuff to make this only costs 15%. If this was true, one of the wealthiest people in the world, God bless him, who just passed away, could have made his whole living just finding better ways of distributing products and services and never made anything in his life. What was his name? And another wealthy person could be a neighbor here in Tennessee who figured out a whole airline just moving products and services around. Fred Smith, Federal Express. And another wealthy person, Ross Perot, could be someone who just supplies these guys information to help them know what things are. Doesn't make anything. What you see is that the wealthiest people in the world of the last 25 years are people who move things around, not people who necessarily make things. If this was true on a national scale, the wealthiest country in the world in 1990 in per capita natural resources, gold, oil, tin, it was the Soviet Union. And if this was true, the wealthiest country in the world in terms of wealth per capita could have no natural resources. Today, Japan, with the highest GNP per person in the world of any major country, has no oil, no tin, no gold, just technology. For those of you who like equations, and it's the only equation in our book, it's W equals P times T. W equals P times T. Wealth equals physical resources times technology. Now, in the past, technology didn't change much over your lifetime. So if you figured out as a historian that the wealth of the world was equal to the physical resources, the oil, the water, the land they had, times the technology of the time, you'd say, so what? Wasn't useful. Why? Because technology in the past didn't change over the lifetime of a single individual. Although we define our ancient ages by the technology of the time, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Industrial Age, the Stone Age, the Information Age, the ages, the technology didn't change over your life. So you were born as a farmer and you had land and you farmed. And how did you get richer? You got more farmland. You didn't think, I'll find a way to better improve the technology of producing more out of the land I have, because it didn't change that fast. Your grandchildren might have a better way of doing it. How did the U.S. get wealthy? Until 1930, the United States, from 1776 to 1930, kept acquiring more and more and more and more land and became a very wealthy nation. But in 1930, they turned inward, and we took the land we had and improved crop yields so far ahead of anyone else in the world, we became the breadbasket of the world by improving the technology of the land we already had. And we seem to find that technology has no limit. In fact, if wealth equals physical resources times technology, and it applies not just to society but you, how many days do you have? That's your physical resources. How strong are you? How bright you are? That's your, quote, fixed physical resources. Your technology is what you make and what you do with them. So you might say, gee, if this starts to make sense, and I do accept now that all the wealthy people in the world of the last 25 years have made their wealth by moving things distribution, not from making new things. You're right, Japan's the wealthiest country in the world and they have no natural resources. If this is true, if wealth equals physical resources times technology, how do I get more technology? That's what you want. Well, what controls the speed with which technology advances? Third law of economic alchemy. The speed with which technology advances is determined entirely by the speed with which we share information. The faster we can communicate, the faster our technology will advance. Galileo wouldn't have discovered that that the sun was at the center of the universe without having access to the work of Copernicus, who wrote it in Polish 80 years earlier. In this model of the world, the written word about 6,000 years ago created civilization. Because now with writing, you could farm and learn something, write it down, and pass it on to a person in another time and place that you had never met. The printing press created the Industrial Revolution. Because now with the printing press, we could quickly disseminate information about better ways of doing things, and everyone could start on what they already knew as opposed to starting from scratch. And the computer, which although it was invented in 1946, just came into our society in 1980 when it went onto the supermarket checkout counter with a barcode scanner, or into the car and doubled our supply of gasoline with a computerized fuel injection. The computer, which is sharing information, is causing an economic explosion we have just begun that will make the Industrial Revolution pale by comparison. And again, it's determined by the wealth equals physical resources times technology, and the amount of technology in society is determined by the speed with which we share information. What's happening, though, is that the speed of technological advance is rapidly accelerating. And it is accelerating so fast and so great that we as a society don't know how to deal with it within single generations. I'll explain. We said before that the farmers went in 1930 to 1980 from 30 million farmers in 1930 to 300,000 in 1980. Quite a change. And the 300,000 in 1980 produced enough food for 3 times the amount of people, and they still could export half again as much food. What happened to all the farmers from 1930 to 1980? What happened to them? Well, most of them just slowly stopped. They kept farming. They were not needed over a linear scale from 1930 to 1980. And what happened? Their children couldn't become farmers. So their children went into other fields. Some went into the record business, big growing business. Some went into working as an auto mechanic or as an engineer designing carburetors. Let's talk about what happened to the farmers' children or grandchildren. In 1980, there were 300,000 people in this country employed in the business making carburetors and repairing them. In 1980, would you have told a child who was very good with his hands, wanted to be an auto mechanic, or was going to college to study engineering not to learn about carburetors? A carburetor was the mainstay of the automobile in 1980. It had been around since 1900, and it was the most important component in controlling gasoline use. Of course you would have said 1980, carburetors, good business, specialize in carburetors. What happened? By 1985, 300,000 people who had spent a lifetime making carburetors were no longer needed. What do we see? The fuel injector replaced the mechanical carburetor, computers. The people making carburetors weren't necessarily computer technicians to work on fuel injectors. And we saw changes that used to take 50 years, from 1930 to 1980 with the farmers, now take place in 5 years. 1985. You could have been in the vinyl record business. Would you have told a child who said, "Mom, Dad, I'm going into making vinyl records"? 100,000 people worked in Ohio and Pennsylvania making vinyl records in 1985. Think about it. Every single household in America had a record player. Everyone you knew had a record collection. Would you tell someone that's a bad business? It's going away? We're not going to need any more records? And what happened? 100,000 people were wiped out in 1990 when in 5 years, the entire record industry shifted from vinyl records to digital CDs. And if you happen to be a lawyer working for vinyl record plants or living in a town where they made vinyl records, everyone you know is completely wiped out. Now, it isn't so negative. The record companies in Los Angeles are selling 3 times today the dollar volume of digital CDs that they did of vinyl records. But do you think the poor guy making vinyl records in Ohio in 1985 is living in Los Angeles writing computer code for digital CDs? What we see is that all of this I'm talking about, until our lifetimes, or really even the last 10 years, was just interesting. You used to sit and Grandpa would tell you what it was like when he was a farmer and how he worked, and you'd say, "Gee, Grandpa, that's interesting. Can I go outside and play now?" Because it wasn't relevant information to you, was it, how Grandpa lived on the farm? Because changes happened over several generations, and the next generation let's learn how to make the new things. Today, this is no longer interesting. Today, this is absolutely critical to the success over 5-year periods or less of you and your children. And oddly enough, as you'll see in some other examples, the answers lie in our past. But in order to understand them, we have to condense time itself and try to realize that we are experiencing over 5 years what our parents or grandparents saw over 50 years. The speed of technological change today is absolutely, and dealing with it is the most critical factor for anyone in becoming successful. We talk a little more about the next 3 laws of economic alchemy. The 4th law of alchemy says that technology determines what creates a need. If you'll study economics, There was a great man, John Maynard Keynes, who was actually the greatest economist of our century. But in 1935, he turned to President Roosevelt, and he said to President Roosevelt, "You'll have a problem in America. Your people are so productive that I can see the day," this is 1935, Keynes told President Roosevelt, "I can see the day when every American will have a 4-bedroom home, a bathroom, and a car. And when they have it, they won't work anymore, and your economy will crash. And you need to put in progressive taxation. You need to tax those people more and more who get that car and that 4-bedroom home, or once they get there, they'll no longer work." Doesn't it sound logical? When people have that house and that car, they'll stop working. Sounds as logical as the planets revolve around the Earth. It's wrong, but it sounds obvious, yet virtually all of our politicians and decision makers today follow that same rule. Let me give you a better example to illustrate it. Assume for a moment we all live on an island, 10 people. Throughout the book, my wife and I use the example of 10 people on an island to illustrate each economic issue. 10 people live on an island, and they all make their living fishing with a fishing line. The 10 people go out every day, they catch fish, and they feed their families. A missionary shows up one day on the island, and this missionary leaves them a net. Now 2 fishermen with the net, one to pilot the boat, one to throw the net, 2 fishermen, can catch all the fish that the whole 10 fishermen used to catch with their lines. Sounds exciting, right? The island's got a huge problem. What's the problem? 80% unemployment. 8 fishermen are no longer needed. So the island's got 2 choices. Choice 1, I know, let's tax the 2 men with the net 80% of their fish and give it to the other 8. Does that make sense? That's exactly what every society in the world did from 1930 to 1990 when advancing technology made some people more advanced than their neighbors in producing goods and services. The proof was we had 0 income tax in 1930. It went to 91% federal marginal income tax in 1959. And Europe rose up higher. Remember when Ronald Reagan took office, we had a 70% marginal federal tax rate for the producers of the society who invent and use the net. Europe was even worse. And then the rest of the world went communist, 100% taxation of the people with the net. What should the island have done? The island should have said, gee, we have 8 people out of work. Why don't you learn how to make better huts? Why don't you find a way to make better schools? Why don't you study diseases and see if we can improve medical care? Why don't you, become an entertainer and give us entertainment at night and improve our lives? The problem is, and the reason we always react as we have to tax the people with the net and give it to the other people, is none of us ever believe that there'll be a new product and service out there. And yet if you look in your Visa card at virtually 90% of what you bought in the last 15 years, what you spend your money on, 90% of it didn't exist about 20 years ago. You buy VCRs, you buy high fashion clothing, you buy product after service and product that didn't exist 20 years ago. But it's so hard to have faith that there'll always be a new job and a new occupation for someone who's displaced by technology. Best example of this is the hardest thing to understand about the theory of economic alchemy is that unemployment caused by technological advance is very good. It's the first sign and the only way we can grow as a nation. Think about this for a moment. When a machine takes away your job, your work is still being done by the machine. That's not a decline in society. That's a transfer in wealth from you to the machine owner. Assume for a minute that I own a restaurant. And in my restaurant, and here's some numbers, I have 3 people working, washing dishes at $200 a week. 3 dishwashers, they manually wash dishes in my restaurant for $200 a week, $10,000 a year each. Cost me $30,000 a year. 3 people wash dishes, $30,000 a year is my expense. They wash my dishes in the restaurant. Along comes an Amway distributor who leases me a dishwasher, an industrial product. And I put that industrial dishwasher in my restaurant. I pay Amway $1,000 a year, and I fire 3 people that I used to pay $30,000 a year to. Now, what's the economy, the world going to say? Boy, Paul's business must be really terrible, right? He just fired 3 people. I mean, watch it, don't extend credit, etc. He's fired 3 people. What's happening in my household? My wife has $29,000 more money. The $30,000 we paid the dishwashers, less the $1,000 for Amway's distributor for the dishwasher. to go out and spend. And what do? We probably lower our prices a little bit, letting more people come into the restaurant, and increase total profits to $45,000 a year. And then we spend some of that $45,000 at Disney World, and some of it on new dresses and new cars and new products and services. Are we employing the 3 dishwashers? No, because they're not in Disney World and they're not in the new products and services. But that's what's happening throughout our economy today. In the last 2 years, we've seen very massive layoffs, and you see it on the front page. It's so funny to open a newspaper today. On the front page of the paper, it says, layoff 5,000 people, Texas Instruments. Layoff 50,000 people, General Motors. Bad news, right? Then you turn to the business page, and you see the Dow Jones has hit 3,400, and that the same companies they're writing about, their stock is taking off. Why? Because the companies doing the layoff are the companies that in 6 months to a year are going to be making a lot of money because they're doing the same work with 50% or less of the employees. This is the reason companies move. Companies don't move from New York or Ohio to North Carolina or to Texas because lower taxes. They move because they have to fire half or more of the employees. They don't have the guts to do it. When J.C. Penney left New York and moved to Dallas, Texas, in my town, they offered 1 year's salary to everyone not to go. No one took. So they offered 2 years' salary to a secretary making $20,000 a year, got a $40,000 check if she quit. You know what happened? 80% of the employees of J.C. Penney in 1987 didn't move to Texas. 20% moved. J.C. Penney's profits took off over $1 billion up the next 2 years, and they never restaffed when they got to Texas. Sears Roebuck, on the other hand, tried to move, got so much political pressure in Chicago, they had to move to a suburb of Chicago where all the executives lived. And you know what happened to them? They had to keep everyone. And it's funny, in the next year, J.C. Penney's sales were up $1 billion over 2 years, and Sears fell by $1 billion. The Sears news made all kinds of headlines. Sears down $1 billion in sales. The good news was J.C. Penney's picked up their sales, and no one reported the positive side. What we see is that every time we see an economic decline, read the paper carefully, and you will see it's a displacement from one group losing to one group winning. Who's rolling with technological change and who's not?
This is the end of Side 1. Please turn the cassette over for the continuation of this program.
In reality, we have an unlimited demand, though, this is the positive side, for new goods and services. First, everyone should be with me now that unemployment, when a machine takes away a job, is terrible for the person being unemployed, but it's not a decline in society because the machine is now doing the work that the person did. The trick is, how fast can we get that individual whose machine has taken his job back to doing a new product and new service? The problem is, we need faith that there'll be a new product and service, and then we'll create it. If I was telling you this in 1960, put your heads on 1960, and you would say to me, Paul, I believe all this, but what are all these people going to do? Well, in 1960, I would have told you that 20% of Americans who are going to lose their jobs in factories are going to go into the restaurant business producing food products because people are going to want to eat out. And in 1960, you would have laughed. You know what you would have told me? In 1960, only 5% of the meals that Americans ate were outside the home. Remember 1960? Rich people went out to dinner, and you went out on Mother's Day or on a birthday. Going out was a special occasion. 5% of the meals were eaten out of the home in 1960. By 1980, not only were 20% of the people in this country employed in the food service business, 50% of the meals that Americans ate were out of the home. 20 years. We went from 5% of the meals out of the home in 1960 to 50%. That's quite a growth. 1,000% increase in the demand for meals eaten out of the home. But could you have believed that in 1960? No way. Because even if you said to me, you know, Paul, supposing you're right, we're going to go to 50% of the meals eaten out of the home. There aren't that many restaurant seats in America, you would have said 1960. I told you, oh no, we're going to build the restaurants. All over America, we'll build restaurants on every highway. You would have laughed. You would have said, that's crazy. There's no place to build them. Oh, we're going to tear down homes and farms and build shopping centers and then put the restaurants in the shopping centers. You would have laughed hysterically in 1960, but by 1980, we had done that. What we see is that we have an unlimited demand for new products and new services. that will employ the people who are displaced by technology. But the problem is we're fighting the displacement. We're not realizing when the technology comes, that's something good. Unemployment due to advancing technology is good because it frees up a man or woman to do something else that improves our lifestyles. One of the problems we have with this is what's happening in retailing in this country. And actually that leads into why I'm so excited to get to speak before your organization today. In retailing, think back to 1930. In 1930, you walked in a store, not even 1930, 1960, and you said, hello, I have this problem. You walked in a department store. So-and-so is getting married, or this is not working in my house, or this type of clothes aren't being cleaned. And you went and told the store your problem. The department store gave you to the clerk, who was an educated person, right? And what did that person do in the store? They taught you what you needed. What we see is that traditional retailing is education, teaching someone a product or service that will improve their life. And then, when they're all done, you say, oh, and would you like it? And then you take it off the shelf and give it to them. In fact, the department stores were very, very good at teaching you what you needed 30 years ago. They weren't too good at getting it because you had to wait so long while they went and rang it up and you hated waiting. But they were very good at their function called teaching people new products and services that will improve their lives, which go on to employ more people because that new product and new service is employing the displaced dishwasher. Everyone with me? Function of retailing, two functions: education, distribution. Teach someone something that will improve their life, then give them the better product distributed. Now what happened? What happened is we couldn't get good people to sit in a store all day and teach you. Remember how 15 years ago you used to say, I went shopping for a dress or a TV and I knew more than the person in the store. You remember complaining about that? How you knew more than the person in the store who was selling it to you? You don't even complain anymore, do you? If you came home and said, I went to Walmart and I knew more than the clerk, they'd go, of course, that's why he's the clerk, right? But today, if you think about it, we've totally accepted that we know more than the clerk. What's happened is the manufacturers of most of our existing products handshake with the consumer through the television set. Michael Jackson tells your kids to buy Pepsi-Cola. And then they go buy Pepsi-Cola or Coca-Cola or any other product. The manufacturer handshakes with the consumer of most products through the mass media, magazines and television, education. The consumer walks into the store like a Walmart or a Kmart and gets it real quick and goes home. What's missing? What's missing is when a new product or new service comes out that will not only improve the consumer's lives, but will add to our economy by employing the people displaced by technology, there's no one left to teach the consumer what they need. The education function of retailing has evaporated from the department store. So if you have a product that you can make a 30-second commercial on and show on television, you can distribute a new product. But if you have something like an Amvox service that's going to greatly improve somebody's life, you're going to talk about that in a 15-second commercial and watch them buy it at Walmart? Start to see the new products and services. The VCR came out in the 70s. It took about 8 years to get going because there were no stores left to teach people what a VCR was and how it would improve their lives by being able to spend more time with their families, et cetera, and record when they wanted, as well as educate themselves through videos. What we see is we have this bottleneck in society today of newly developed things that will improve our lives, and we don't have a system to teach people how to get them. There is one little company that's doing okay, but the problem is it's too small. Last year in America, retail sales in shopping centers were $717 billion. That's a number you should write, 717. Retail sales in shopping centers in America, products, were $717 billion. Services were well over $1,000 billion that was sold to people in America. And I said there's this little company that is really trying hard, and if they would get really going and become big, they could dramatically improve the problem we have in America about educating people to new products and services. Guess the little company's name? Little old Amway has gone from $3 billion last year to $4 billion this year. Wait a minute, no accolades. I will take it when you're 30 billion, which will be in several years, but think how meaningless 30 billion is when the retail shopping centers who don't educate their consumers are able to do 717 billion, and the services outside the shopping centers are 1,000 billion. So I will take your applause when you're at 30 billion, because it'll tell me then you're on the right direction. to dealing with the bottleneck we have in retailing in this country, which is educating consumers. If any of you want to make my wife or I mad, tell me what you sold one day. You guys don't sell anything. Selling something is giving somebody a product they don't need or want. You educate people about products and services that will improve their lives. You're the only ones in America doing it, which is why every manufacturer of new products and services is lined up in Ada, Michigan to say, please take my product and service. I mean that very seriously. Because if you'll talk to manufacturers in getting people back to work in this country, we need to educate to the consumer, because the price of everything they buy in Walmart keeps declining. They have more money in their wallet. We need to keep them spending it on new products and services that will improve their lives. And you are doing a really wonderful job. The problem is volume. Now, the volume will grow on its own because you're all there is. You've done some very, very exciting things in the last few years by devotion to the consumer, the best product. We'll talk about that in a moment, but you really need to grow in a very significant way, because you're our only hope of educating consumers to new products and services which make the economy grow. Otherwise, prices just go down and they don't spend it. And the Keynesian model of the 30s is correct, that they get the 4-bedroom home when they stop working. In the fourth law of economic alchemy, I say that technology defines what creates a need. When Henry Ford invented the automobile in 1914, he was laughed at. Why? Because he said, I've made an affordable automobile that every American can afford. And they said, so what, Henry? Why would an American need a car? They all live near where they work, and there's no roads to go drive on. So before long, we built shopping centers in suburbs and an American lifestyle that's the envy of the world. But the demand for the automobile didn't exist when he made it. If you look at your Visa cards, you'll see in your bills that all of your expenses in the last year are new products and services that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago, and the speed is accelerating. We talk about quantity and quality demand. Demand is totally endless with a consumer properly served for this reason. Take for a moment a consumer, a 22-year-old boy gets out of college and needs a suit. He goes into a department store and he buys a suit, right? First suit. Never had a suit before. He buys that suit and he wears it to work on Monday and on Tuesday, and what does he need on Wednesday? A second suit, because he can't wear the same suit twice, or twice in the same day or week. And what we see is that when a consumer buys a product, because of what we call quantity demand, he's always demanding more and more of the same product. Now, some Keynesian economists and most of our government politicians will tell you, but it'll end. We got to start raising his taxes because he'll stop buying. Once he's got 20 suits, right? He won't buy another suit, will he? Wrong. When he has 20 $200 suits, he buys one suit one day for $400, doesn't he? And when you buy one $400 suit and you have 19 $200 suits, do you like your $200 suits anymore? You want more, and you go buy one $400, you need a whole wardrobe of $400, or ties or shoes. Better example. By the way, the Japanese know this cold. It's a shame that someone from outside, but maybe that's the way it had to be, could study the American consumer and learn this. GM makes a Chevrolet. It's a great car, and it makes it for years, and it keeps making a Chevrolet, and every year it sells the Chevrolet to the person, and he says, I got a Chevy. And then one day he gets disloyal, and GM says, oh, that rotten American didn't buy my Chevy. What does Japan do? Japan made a great car called a Toyota. And then when the consumer wanted a second Toyota, they bought two Toyotas for the garage. Then when the consumer went and made more money and wanted a BMW, Japan made a Lexus. What Japan says is, I will stay with my consumer, and I won't just sell them the same product and go to work home every night at 4:30 or 5. I will find out what they're shifting between quantity demand and quality demand. Quantity demand, more of what they already have. Quality demand, a better quality product. And Japan understands this and has ridden from becoming in 1960s. Remember, they made everything the cheapest, and you bought more and more of it, quantity. Then they shifted to higher quality because that's what we want once we have all of what we want. Americans don't understand this. They're trying to push the same product. One of the things I'm so impressed with about Amway is it made a company selling a better quality soap and household products that were made by Amway. And then it noticed that in some products, it doesn't make the best. So what did it do? It went out, think of this, think of General Motors selling Ford. It went out and found the best name brand products and put it in the line because it knew that at the end of the line was a customer, and he was going to buy the better product somewhere else. And you find where your company has the best product, they stay with it. Until they hear from who? You. Why? Because you use it. You don't just sell it. And you tell them this is no longer the best. They improve it, or they put somebody else's brand name product in it. Show me another manufacturer, retailer in the country that can put their ego aside and carry somebody else's line when it's a better product or service. I should point out that I've gone through and I've gone off on a little bit on a few topics. The sixth law of economic alchemy is perhaps the most exciting. And in the sixth law, my wife and I talk about the technology gap. And what's funny about this is we had to invent a word called technology gap because it didn't exist. And yet when I tell you it, it's so obvious. The technology gap, this is the sixth law of economic alchemy, is the difference between the way in which we do something today and the better way out there that's already developed that we haven't yet utilized. A technology gap in the automobile industry would be a bias ply tire that gets 10,000 miles and shifting to radials gets 60,000 miles. A technology gap would be a shift from a carburetor to a fuel injector. It gets twice the mileage, and most important, the technology gap is invisible to the consumer. To drive a car with a carburetor and switch to driving a car with an electronic computerized fuel injector, do you have to learn about computers? To shift from tires that don't skid in the rain like radials and get 6 times the mileage, do you have to learn how to drive a radial? We have technology out there on the shelf. To your business, it's better products and services that will improve your lives and the lives of your other distributors and customers that they don't know about that will improve their lives. And when we implement that technology gap, that's what causes us to grow. And if you're going into any business today, you would look around the business and say, well, if I'm going to go in the automobile business, how many cars use carburetors? Wow, I'll make a fuel injector in Japan and make a better car. How many cars people in this neighborhood use dial phones? I'll sell them push-button phones. We do it implicitly. We don't just go into business. We look at the business. We look at the technology gap, the better things already developed out there that will improve our customers' lives that are not yet implemented. The greatest technology gaps today are in the business of distributing products and services. The retailers have abandoned the education function. Today, 85% of the cost of a product in a store is in its distribution cost. And the reason is we're still encouraging our kids, like from the movie in 1967, go make things. Well, God bless them, a few of them we make things, but right now our big backlog is in better ways of distributing things, not better ways of making things, because we've lost the mechanism of the old department store to educate people about a better product and service that'll improve their lives. Let me talk a little bit about change. It's funny how so many of us think, oh, I use computers. I am into technology. I am one of the leaders in my group. I'm the fastest learning person in my company. I like change. Wrong. Nobody likes change. In fact, we fight it. And what's terrible is when I give you a new computer to learn, or any new product or service, you fight, you kick, you scream, you run to the boss, I don't want to learn it, I don't want to do it, I don't want to have to learn this. And you fight, kick, and scream to avoid it to the last minute. So one day I call you in if I'm your supervisor and say, you're fired, or our company's out of business if you don't learn this tonight. Then you learn it, and you know what? You become the biggest, messiah for it. This is the greatest thing in the world, this is terrific, everything's wonderful, this is great new computer. But you know what you forget to do? You forget when you have to teach it to someone to stop bragging and to say, I was terrified when they made me learn this. I didn't think I'd ever learn this. We forget about our fears. I think it's something to do with the fact that learning something new is sometimes so scary to us. That part of it is we psych ourselves up that once we've learned it, we forget the pain. And we brag about how easy it is, and we forget to teach the next person how difficult it is to change and learn things. We just brag about how we're always learning, and they go, oh, that's for you. I can't learn new things. It's funny, if you walk in a company today, the old recipe for success was learn something real well and do it well. Today, that's a recipe for failure. If you worked in an office and said, I'm going to learn how to type the letter on this word processing program better than anyone else, for a short period of time, you'd get ahead. But then a new word processing program would come out that the person who learns it the fastest is 3 times more productive. What we see is success is determined entirely today by the person who learns new things the fastest, rather than the person who learns older things the best. If you look, I'm told I got some questions. I've been running off a little bit here. Good, let me get some questions. I know some of you have passed in.
some? If anyone has some, we can feed them up to you.
And if anyone's got some more, please just write them down in a card and pass them up front. Okay. We get questioned about Amway approaching saturation. Do you think this is true? I think I talked about this. That's my reverse problem. I think that question was asked before I covered that point. Keep in mind you're about 4 billion today. You can look backwards and brag how you went from 3 billion and be real proud of yourselves and decline like every other company. Or you can realize how tiny you are in the marketplace of what you do, of 717 billion of products sold in shopping centers last year and 1,000 billion of services. And you can realize that's where your growth is. Your organization, though, I will commend you to this, has now reached critical mass. By critical mass, that's the level of a nuclear reactor where it can sustain its own reaction without additional fuel. Your organization's at critical mass. It's large enough now to grow on its own. It's large enough now that the manufacturers of the new services, particularly in products, line up to come to you. You don't have to go out as difficult. And you're starting to get the products and services that are pulled from the consumer rather than pushed. You're getting the kind of products now, and you're getting the recognition in your communities that you have the product that the consumer says, where's an Amway distributor? I have this problem. I need this product. And that's very, very exciting. We have a question of what's happening to corporations in most corporate America. I want to talk a little bit about that. This is so sad because so many of us don't really keep up with economics because we've given up that there's a working theory that makes some sense to us. Again, because all economic theories are built on scarcity. In October 1991, the Nobel Prize in Economics was awarded to Ron Coase. I bet most of you ever heard Ron Coase, and yet if you look up the old newspapers, he won the Nobel Prize for Economics 6 months ago, and he is our 1992 Nobel Prize winner in economics. Oddly enough, he's not even an economist. And they gave Ron Coase the Nobel Prize in Economics this year for a paper he wrote in 1931. Think of this story. In 1931, a 20-year-old London college student wrote an essay about America and gets an award to travel America for a summer. This 21-year-old, he turns 21 in America in 1931, and in 1931, he is fascinated by America. He says, I don't get it, because he had studied America in England as a boy. And he had read Alex de Tocqueville, the French commentator of the 19th century, who wrote about how great America was. And he said in 1931, America is the land of opportunity. America is a firm where every person can do anything they want, the land of Horatio Alger. Why are all these Americans joining companies? Why are they signing up to work for somebody else? It doesn't make any sense. So in 1931, he wrote a paper called The Nature of the Firm. The Nature of the Firm, 1931, 21 years old. 60 years later, that paper had been the most quoted paper in economics, and that paper won the Nobel Prize for Economics this year. In that paper, he said that the reason people go to work for companies is something called transaction costs. And he defined the term. It's now a common term in economics, transaction costs. He said, sure, everyone would want to be in business for themselves, but the transactions cost of doing business, doing payroll, hiring people, filling out payroll taxes, writing checks, remember the cash economy then, handling money, buying goods and services, inventory, all the transaction costs prevent people from doing it. In fact, he wrote a formula that said, when people get together and all work in one business, it's inefficient and wasteful. That's called inefficiency costs. And we all know that if we work in a big company once in our lives. When they work on their own, they're very efficient, but they have high transaction costs. And the level at which transaction cost equals inefficiency cost is the level of size for the firm. And running his mathematical models in 1931, he predicted corporations like General Motors with 800,000 employees. He predicted all these large companies. And his paper, which started out with why would an American go work for someone else when they didn't have to, became the standard corporate paper that says why large corporations exist. Well, today, my wife and I in 1991 began rerunning his mathematical equations and saying today transaction costs aren't so high, are they? You can pick up the telephone and order goods from around the country and they can ship them tomorrow night. Computers do all the paperwork for us. Today, what would Ron Coase say about the optimal size of all those companies he predicted would be large companies in 1931? Today, the large companies should not exist. Today, virtually all companies are trying to find some way to disband themselves. Most of them just move from one large employment area to another and hope the people don't go. And today, the people are so scared they go, so they offer them. Do you realize IBM today offers every executive making over $100,000 a year twice their annual salary to quit, no matter where they are? What they're really saying is, we don't need you, and we don't have the guts to fire you or to lower your salary to a realistic level, so please go. And I'll up the price even more to keep going. When you see a company doing it, take their first offer, because that means they're going out of business, and when they run out of money, they're not going to keep handing it out to you. And it also means they don't have the guts to do what they do, which is pay people for performance. One of the things we're starting to play with is, I'm just starting to think of this now for the first time, is that your company may be this ideal model that has a central place lowering transaction costs but captures that entrepreneurial spirit. So in many, many ways, you may be the model of the future organization. You're certainly the only one out there that captures the benefits of both. If any of you doubt some of this, next time you read about a layoff at a public company, watch the stock price. And watch how smart Wall Street is to know, buy the stock of the companies laying off the people because they found a way to do it with 1/3 the employees, and they have the guts to lay them off, which is tough decisions. They're almost in the dilemma of Jonah today. Remember Jonah and the whale? When the ship was sailing from Tarshish and couldn't make it? They knew there was someone on the ship that was causing the problem, Jonah, by running away from the Lord, and they threw him overboard to save everyone else. Well, corporate America today has to throw overboard, they think, half the people, but it's only a question until they throw everybody overboard, unless they develop a model of paying people for their own performance and their own individual self-reliance. We hear a lot about Japan. You know, one of the exciting things is that Japan, and talking about Japanese distribution is a question, one of the exciting things about Japan is what you guys are doing in Japan. And you need to understand Japanese retailing to understand why Amway is taking off in Japan and will take off in every country of the world right now. Remember I said how inefficient the U.S. was in distribution because we haven't applied our talents to it in a large scale? Very similarly, the rest of the world is far behind us. In 1920, we had a company in this country called W.T. Grants. And W.T. Grants invented the department store, a way to distribute goods at better prices to people. You know what happened? When W.T. Grants opened up in Pennsylvania and then other states, every state in 1920 that W.T. Grants opened passed a law prohibiting department stores. They said it was illegal to sell products like this to put all the local merchants out of business. You can see why they passed it. And in late 1920s, the Supreme Court actually in 1933 ruled it unconstitutional to pass a law against consumers getting a better deal. But in 1933, they put in fair trade laws. Remember fair trade laws? This is incredible. Until 1971 in this country, you were going to go to jail if you sold a name brand product lower than the price to a consumer. And in 1971, we abandoned fair trade laws. Looking back over this, when we look at retailing in America, we could say the good guys won, right? It's better that consumers can get lower prices and better education and better products and services, and they take that money and they buy more. In America, the good guys won. Well, in Japan, the rest of the world, the good guys didn't win. In Japan today, it is illegal to open a store of greater than 5,000 square feet. That's a little store, without the written permission of every single retailer who will be affected in a 1.6-mile trading area. In Japan today, it is illegal to sell goods below or less than their list price. And in fact, you buy the franchise to sell apples or to sell a product or service in a different area, and you're protected by the government. In fact, the funniest thing that happened was with Matsushita. Matsushita made a cordless phone that was super popular in Japan for $300. And they took that phone, an American came over, and at Best Products here, retail, bought up all the phones for about $90 and brought them back to Japan. They're made in Japan, shipped to a U.S. retailer. The guy bought up all these phones and brought them back to Japan, was selling them for $150. And the company bought up every one of his products, $8 million worth at full price, just to get them off the market. And one very creative company has found a way to distribute products and services in Japan, and the consumers are going wild to the tune of $1 billion from nowhere, and you're it. We talk about Japan. Keep in mind that the camera you buy in the United States for $100, Japanese made, is sold in Tokyo for $300. Seriously. It leaves Tokyo, $50 FOB. Tokyo is sold in America for $100. It's sold in Japan for $300 because of these layers of protected distribution. More exciting, though, Japan, though, is in a serious economic problem, which we are the beneficiary of. We talk about Japanese economic power, and there's a book called The Enigma of Japanese Power, the falsity of it, and you'll see why in a moment. You've all heard how many Japanese cars are sold in America. Last year in America, there were 10 million cars sold. 10 million new cars were sold in the United States last year. Okay, 10 million new cars. 3.7 million of those new cars were Japanese. Everyone with me? 37%. 3.7 million of 10 million cars sold here last year were Japanese. Let me call out a number. What percent of the cars that were sold here that were Japanese, the 3.7 million, how many or what percent of the 3.7 million Japanese cars sold here last year were fully made in America? And by fully made, I mean if it was 75% of the parts were made here, only count 3/4 of it. What percent would you think? 62%. In 1991, there were 3.7 million Japanese cars sold here. 2.2 million of them were fully made in America. That's quite a number. Why don't you hear about this? You don't hear about this because in Japan, it would make the politicians go wild that they brought all their factories over here to employ American workers. In fact, let's talk about what's happening in Japan when they come here. By the way, what's the number one automobile plant in the world that everybody flies in the auto industry to see, and they have a whole tour section set up? Marysville, Ohio, exactly. In Marysville, Ohio, they produce, think of this number, 450,000 brand new Honda Accords a year. Think of an assembly line with 450,000 cars coming off. 80,000 of those cars get shipped straight back to Tokyo with Japanese labels where they closed the Tokyo plant because the American workers were so much more efficient. And at that same plant produces 750,000 engines for the 450,000 cars, selling the 300,000 of them to Chrysler. Now, why are the Japanese so efficient? Well, when they come over here to employ Americans, you know what they do to us? I don't mean to sound it out. Let me finish before you attack me on this. When the Japanese employer comes to Marysville, Ohio, and says, I want to build a plant and employ 100,000 Americans, he's got a problem when he interviews you. You know what the problem is? You all look alike to him. So when he comes in and you tell him I go to this church, or my father was in the union, or I went to school with so-and-so, he nods and smiles and has no idea what you're talking about. So instead he gives you some papers, say fill these out, he puts you on a machine, tests your ability, and he hires you for what you can do tomorrow as opposed to corporate America that hires you for who you know or what you did yesterday. Now, let me not say in this that the Japanese are so wonderful. They're not doing this. If you had common things to talk about and make friends with them, he'd hire you. I mean, think how we all recruit. We hire people on resumes, what they did yesterday. We hire people on who they know because they make friends with us. He doesn't know, so he hires you on your ability tomorrow. And Japan goes into Appalachia and takes Americans that we've forgotten, who we kicked out because their father didn't have the right opportunity, and makes them the most productive automobile workers in the world, bar none. And they're doing a wonderful, wonderful service by opening these plants here. In fact, virtually all the Sony TVs, all the VCRs next year will be fully made here. VCRs is another thing you hear politicians tell you, oh, those Japanese, they make all the VCRs. I go, yeah, I feel terrible for them. You know, let me tell you about, I go to Japan a lot. You know what they talk about with the VCR business? The ultimate ripoff. They make a VCR today, and they really don't. They created the business by lowering the price, and then they thought they'd keep selling us the VCRs. Well, they lost the business to the Koreans and the Taiwanese. But think of it. You go out and buy a VCR for $250, right? Once. It lasts 8 years. Then you spend $400 a year for 8 years on tapes to watch on it. The movies you buy are all made in America. You want your kids watching Japanese movies? That's what their kids watch, American movies. And we have these politicians who think it's worth complaining about that they make the VCRs. We don't miss the VCR is just the wrapper. The money's in the movie. They're all American made with American values and American actors. Other questions? Is the deficit a problem in America? That's one. No, we've got a pile more. You'll tell me. Is a deficit. That's one that is hyped up to such a level like America's crashing. First, we need to watch our spending because I believe the government spends money much less efficiently than consumers or private sector would spend money. And that's obvious. And so we need to find some way to educate people about that they're better spending their own money than some federal government. But that's not the problem. Instead, we have hyped up this deficit issue to where it's going to tank the economy. You hear those stories? You're going to hear it all through the election year. Don't try. Don't go ahead. There's so much debt out there, you'll never pay it back. Totally wrong. And here's why. Assume you have a person making $100,000 a year after tax income. Goes to work, makes $100,000 a year. Nice income. And they have a home mortgage of $80,000. Would you say that person has too much debt? That's their total debt? $100,000 income, $80,000 home mortgage, at 10% cost him $8,000 a year in debt service. So he earns $100,000, he's got to pay $8,000 a year interest on his $80,000 mortgage. Would you worry about that guy? No. That's exactly where the federal government is. We have a total GNP today of about $6.5 trillion, $6,500 billion. That's our production. And we have a total debt of about $4 trillion. Same ratio, about 80%. It's actually a little lower. It's not going to break us. Not only that, I don't even think it's debt. I'll tell you why. It's capital investment. See, the federal government has no capital budget. When the state of North Carolina says, let's build a bridge across the river, and it costs $100 million, do they one year just expense the $100 million? No. They invest the $100 million in the bridge floating a bond issue, right? And then they say the tolls and increased revenue from the bridge will be $2-3 million a year, which over 30 years will pay back the 100. Everyone with me? Capital budgeting. A business goes out and borrows money for a plant that's growing. You invest time and money in yourselves, and then you reap it over years. Well, the federal government doesn't have such a budget. So when Ronald Reagan says in 1981 that he wasn't satisfied with America and we should build it up, he goes out and builds an aircraft carrier for $1 billion in 1981, and it gets shown up as debt. Everyone with me? Because the federal government has no capital budget. He spent $1 billion more than he had in 81 building an aircraft carrier. That aircraft carrier did us a wonderful job in 1991 in the Gulf, didn't it? We paid for it 10 years before. More important, that buildup in the military broke the Soviet Union, and now we're going to be able to save hundreds of billions a year by not having our great enemy with all those nuclear weapons at us. That was an investment. So I would submit to you the Reagan debt increased from $1 trillion to $3 trillion, $2 trillion. But here's the real test. It doesn't matter how much money you borrow. It matters what you borrow it for, right? If you want to borrow money at 10% and invest it in a business that makes 20%, is that bad? That's terrific. You're all business people. You know this. Start teaching it to Americans. From 1981 to 1988, we increased the debt from $1 trillion to $3 trillion. We borrowed $2,000 billion in total over 8 years, more than we brought in. Okay, what happened to the economy? GNP increased $2.6 trillion a year, meaning we borrowed $2 trillion over 8 years total. The GNP went up $2.6 trillion a year. That's a 130% annual return on your investment. That's not a good return to business. Would you invest in a business that gave you 130% return a year? Now, we have to watch what we borrow, and we have to keep government from spending money. So in the 1980s, those of us who knew what was happening shut up about this and let the average American hear about the deficit because we thought that would make the congressman stop spending the money. Instead, it got people so scared that we can't afford to pay off the debt. The reason also is that we, thank God, have a country with a $6.5 trillion GNP and only a $1.3 trillion government, meaning about 25% of our, quote, economy is government. In England or Russia or any other country, it's 100%. So we keep comparing the debt we all owe to just the federal budget receipts, taxes, not the whole total economy. It's not an amount. Those of you who want more, there's a whole chapter on this in the book. I'm not saying we shouldn't cut spending and take away the money from the congressmen they're wasting, but it's not in any way even affecting our economic output or behavior. I love these questions. People want specifics. What is the best thing to be investing in today? What should I do with all this money I'm making in my Amway distributorship? I love that question. You may not like the answer. I guess I have to tell the story about the first day I was in class. And here I'm 19 years old. I get into Wharton Business School for my MBA, and I first class the stock market. I'm going to learn how to make money in stocks, right? I don't have to work. I'm just going to invest. This was the very first class. It was called How the Wharton MBA, they said, when you get your MBA from here, becomes a stockbroker. And here's what they told me to do. You go out and you buy a list of 10,000 rich people, which is an easy list to get. And I take the 10,000 rich people, I'm a stockbroker with my Wharton MBA right out of school, and I send 5,000 of them a letter, General Motors is going up tomorrow. Okay. 5,000 get a letter, GM is going down. Next day, GM goes up, I rip apart one list, right? And I've got 5,000 people, you could be one, that got a letter that said GM's going up. The next day, I send you another fax. Ford Motors going up to 2,500, Ford Motors going down to 2,500. Everyone with me? Now I rip up one list, and you're one of the good people. 2,500 people now I've been right twice, right? Now I divide it to 1,250 and 1,250. Chrysler's going up, I tell 1,250 tomorrow. 1,250 say Chrysler's going down. And on, 625, 300. Now there's 40 people at the end who have gotten 9 letters from me, and I've always been right. You're one. How much money won't you borrow from everyone you know when I call you up and say, can I invest in the stock market for you? That's what's really happening when you know the guy who's always been right. He's either going to jail or you're at the end of the line, the 40 of the 10,000. I'm dead serious. The crime in America is people go and develop a business and they work hard as doctors, lawyers, as Amway distributors, whatever they do. And they get very good. That's why they make money. And you know what they do? They go find someone they believe who's just put on earth to make them rich. They forget all the things they learned and they go and gamble. Now what happens? When you invest in the stock market and it goes down, how do you improve from that? What did you learn? I try to explain to people that your investment should be an absolute win-win. You shouldn't be able to lose. You should either make money because the investment worked, or you should have an experience that teaches you something that'll help you make money tomorrow. Then you can't lose, can you? When you invest in some people you show the plan to, and you find some group, and that particular group with those behaviors don't do anything, and you wasted a couple of evenings of your time. Did you learn something? When you find people who are responsive in a certain group and you know with these personality traits they will go well, did you learn something? Well, of course they made money. Every time you're about to invest, say, does it meet my criteria? Will it either make me money or teach me something about myself and my business that I can make money with? Then you can't lose. When you invest in your own business, you always do that. Do you learn something every time you show the plan to someone? Do you find you can teach something you've learned a little bit from everyone you meet? You can't lose. You either find someone who's successful with you or someone you teach. So I can't stress enough to people, there's no panacea out there. It's keep going and invest in yourselves. Remember always what a diamond is. What's a diamond? A diamond is a piece of coal that's been under a lot of pressure for a long time. Also remember that you'll only learn by your mistakes. You don't learn a thing when you make the right decision, because you show the plan to someone, they go on well, and you think you're great. It's when something goes wrong, you learn and can apply it the next time. When things are going well, you never learn. And you want to rise up there as someone who's learned, not just doing it, waiting for a crash. At this point, I've got to really bring... I do all this stuff and have a lot of fun, but I got to tell you that all the research, all the background, and all the work that goes into my books is a team effort. And I'd like to introduce the economist, Donna Casey Pilser.
Thank you. It is truly an honor for us both to be here today. And we really are very positive about Amway. We feel like Amway is on a trajectory going straight up. And to be part of the educational process and to share this with you, we are truly honored. Thank you for having us.